stay back. There's allowed to be another one.
Downtown Portland, Oregon found itself rocked by an explosion in the restroom at Lonsdale Square along Southwest Salmon Street, nearly destroying it. A man tipped off authorities from a nearby payphone 10 minutes in advance, allowing the area to be cleared. Shortly before the explosion, an officer, Roy Tursek, saw a man leave a nearby phone booth and began moving away from the scene at a brisk pace. Suspicious, Tursek gave pursuit and caught the man, 39-year-old Norman Elmer Miller, as he tried to get into his car. This is where they both heard the explosion, at which time Tursek said Miller's face went ashen. Arrested on the scene, Miller was believed responsible for other explosions in town from someone who called himself a, quote, James Bond good guy. Seriously. Come June of 1980, Miller would be convicted and given a 20-year sentence. He was a man with a lot to say about the adverse state of the city, but when it came to his specific actions here, a key motivating factor for him was that he wanted to stop the Cadillac Fairview Development Project.
He indicated that he was going to start bombing again because he had received no action on his previous phone calls where he was making demands that property taxes should be lowered and Cadillac Fairview should be stopped.
And what was the Cadillac Fairview Project? Also known generally, and more so later on as the Morrison Street Development Project, it was a planned redevelopment by a Canada-based company called Cadillac Fairview Corporation Limited. This project would have been one of the largest ever done in the city, controlled by one company, and it was, at the time, the most expensive planned redevelopment project that Portland had ever seen. It also never happened, at least how originally planned. In the end, this was only the beginning of a decade-long effort to convert 4 city blocks into something new, a project filled with resistance and delays from a populace who knew the world of Portland from the 1970s and didn't know exactly where we were going to go once the 1980s had arrived. March 20th, 1980 was a day that started out like any other. But if you picked up a copy of a local paper, you might have stumbled onto a story regarding the Cadillac Fairview Company taking a serious interest in redeveloping 4 blocks in downtown Portland between Southwest 3rd and 5th Avenues and Taylor and Morrison Streets. Established in 1974 with the merger of the Fairview Corporation and Cadillac Development, they had become North America's largest public real estate development company by 1979. And now these guys were looking at a Portland project that would cost potentially $85 million, the most expensive in Portland history. Cadillac Fairview, or CF as I'll call them, were also influenced by the likes of the Radisson Hotel Corporation out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the I. Magnin department store chain based out of San Francisco, who were both excited about planting roots in Portland. It was very interesting to see such companies interested in this city. And beyond that, there was another even larger project in the works further north in the city's Chinatown area. This 5.5 block-sized project was being run by another Canadian developer, DIDN Pacific. The plans were to call their development site Pacific Square. The reason I call these projects interesting is, well, let's just call it the inconsistent state that Portland had been in during previous years. Come 1980, the city would find its population had decreased by more than 16,000 people since 1970. Sure, some of these people may have just moved to a nearby Portland suburb, but still, a dwindling population is not exactly encouraging to an outside developer. Even with previous efforts to revitalize the city, in particular the South Auditorium Urban Renewal Project during the 1960s, the city was still pocketed with rough areas, especially around downtown. One of these areas was the lesser-known other Skid Row area, with the more known Skid Row being up in Old Town Chinatown. This one bordered the 4 planned redevelopment blocks to the south, lined with rundown older hotels and dive bars, and interestingly enough, the county courthouse and city hall as well. Lots of these hotels would find themselves shut down for various fire code and safety violations. And at 3rd and Taylor, to the southeast corner of this redevelopment site, stood the 1883 Gilbert Building, which had been operating as the Taylor Hotel for decades. But come 1979, it was just another rundown flophouse. In a rougher area, and with CF planning on buying the land so that they would control it afterward, the idea may have been that this land could be obtained for a far more reasonable price than in other parts of town. That may have been what Dion Pacific was also thinking as they were chasing a project in the other Skid Row area. And the 70s were a time of various struggles all across America, most memorable perhaps being the gas crisis as well as lingering inflation. Portland was not immune to any of this. And yet the city was not entirely stagnant, with some of its most well-known buildings erected during this decade, such as the Wells Fargo Tower, originally called the First Interstate Tower, the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building, and the Standard Insurance Center. But as the skyline grew, the previous years saw many a historic building vanish, oftentimes to create more surface parking for the ever-growing number of cars coming in and out of downtown each day. Despite this, the city continued to have congestion and parking issues through the 1970s. Architectural critic and writer Ada Louise Huxtable took a shot at the city, saying it looked like a scattered bomb site, targeting the extensive space in downtown that had been converted to blacktop parking. It was depressing. It was not attractive. Portland wasn't a hole in the wall by any means. It wasn't a hell on earth, but it wasn't exactly flourishing in all aspects. And some liked it that way. This was still a period where a lot of locals liked their city just the way it was, perfect or imperfect. Certainly an understandable perspective, depending on who you are. And something that's never fully gone away with the strong "go back to California" sentiment that's been around the city really since the dawn of the new millennium. The counter to all of this, an added incentive for a company like Cadillac Fairview, was that the city had been desperate to revive its downtown retail core. And here was a company looking to revive multiple downtown blocks, more than half of which were just more of that bland street-level parking, with a project that would include numerous fresh shopping options. And they were looking to complete this project for under $100 million, which is a lot of cash, but considering the possibilities to be had there, it may very well have been worth it. The added benefits, above all else, is that the project was slated to create more than 1,000 new jobs, and it most certainly would have created a substantial increase in tax revenue for the city. So what exactly was the plan here? At least at the start, because projects this large almost always make changes here and there. The original plan was to completely redevelop the blocks between 3rd and 5th and Morrison and Taylor. This would mean a complete removal of everything on these blocks, which would have included 3 buildings of historical significance. The aforementioned Gilbert Building, aka the Taylor Hotel, at 3rd and Taylor, and the Corbett and Goodenough buildings that stood along 5th Avenue between Morrison and Yamhill Streets. Early diagrams show the southwesternmost block would be a hotel, presumably a Radisson, while the southeasternmost block would be an office building. The northeasternmost block would be a department store, and the northwesternmost block would have several retail stores and eateries. The hotel was projected to have between 250 and 350 rooms, and the office building was projected to be one of the largest in the city at that time. While this project would provide a much-needed spike in the downtown shopping district, it would have also been in close proximity to other stores, such as Meyer and Frank, of which the project had plans to have a tunnel go under Morrison from their site to this store, and the recently opened Nordstrom store only 2 blocks away. This was also during the early planning stages of converting a parking area to today's Pioneer Courthouse Square. An ultimately very controversial collection of sky bridges were planned for the project as well, connecting it to surrounding buildings and at least one parking garage. With multi-story retail space planned, it was felt if access only came from street level, that this would adversely affect businesses on upper floors. But if there was street level access as well as sky bridges a few stories up, customers would have multiple options and incentive to visit multiple floors. And while this project would be forced to change, find itself mired in endless controversy, during these early stages, many people, in particular local businessmen, saw this project as the miracle the city's retail hub had been holding out for. And that very perspective stemmed from 2 plans put forward by the city during the 1970s, the 1972 Downtown Plan and the 1974 Downtown Waterfront Urban Renewal Plan. The 72 plan, more than anything, was a set of guidelines to use for any given future projects, to know which ones would fit the city's vision for the future and which ones wouldn't. A key aspect of this plan was to revitalize downtown's retail core, which even they admitted had been diminishing over the years. The establishment of shopping malls outside the downtown area like Lloyd Center, Washington Square, Vancouver Mall, and even Mall 205 had helped in this. And the Clackamas Town Center Mall, opening in 1981, was not far down the road. It was felt more stores and restaurants were needed, and not far from the waterfront. The hope was also to decrease vehicular traffic in the area for safety's sake, as well as providing a more pleasant shopping experience for everyone. The planned retail core area was set to exist primarily between 3rd and 11th Avenues and Stark and Taylor Street, putting the CF project just inside the boundary to the far southeast corner. In an early diagram of this area from 1972, it suggested a parking structure was planned for the northeasternmost of these 4 blocks. Not much else planned otherwise. And as far as the urban renewal plan, adopted in 1974, a key element obviously was eliminating blight in the downtown area within a specific boundary which ran from Hoyt Street to the north down to Jefferson Street to the south. And in the vicinity of this planned project, the renewal boundary ran between 5th Avenue and the waterfront. Once again, a plan wherein this project just barely fit within the boundaries. And because the blocks CF wanted existed within an urban renewal area, this meant that, if accepted, the city could condemn everything on those blocks and then sell the land to a developer. This was going to become a pretty big issue later on. By 1979, not a great deal had been done to revitalize the downtown retail core, and here was this massive development company promising at least one massive department store, mall, and store space. And this brings us back around to the beginning of this story. Remember that just about everyone first heard about this plan in news reports, wherein CF had obviously come to the city with a large plan for a specific location in downtown. The plan had already been presented to the Portland Development Commission, or the PDC, and they were already planning on studies to see if the project was feasible. If this sounds like things were perhaps moving rather quickly, it's because they were. While a lot of these 4 blocks was just street-level parking, there were still several buildings there, in various conditions, but together they held 38 retail businesses, many of which were small businesses. And how did the property owners, as well as these business owners, find out about this new plan? Either in the paper or by a letter. Honestly, everybody else in town probably knew about this pending project just as quickly as those who were going to potentially be displaced by it. And while there was not much in the realm of residential space, the Taylor Hotel still housed nearly 40 people, many of whom were destitute, disabled, and/or living in abstract poverty. Most people in the area received a letter from the PDC, delivered by someone who said they did not know what the letter consisted of. The contents within simply alerted them of the project. Those in the area felt this was a pretty trashy way to learn this life-altering information, and a lot of the hostility was directed at CF specifically for not coming to them in the first place, but instead skipping right to the PDC. In the past, the city had come to the owners, and oftentimes an area was slated to be completely redeveloped before a developer even came along. Again, like the South Auditorium project. But now this foreign company comes in and the tables were being turned, with the developer becoming the driving force behind the redevelopment. While mayor and creeper of the universe Neil Goldschmidt had been wanting to redevelop these specific blocks for years, there had been no plan in place, nor had any other developers expressed an interest in the space. The very "this is our city" sect of Portland was not happy that the PDC seemed to be bending over backwards for some outsiders. While what was left on these blocks was fairly rough around the edges, it consisted of some beloved businesses ranging from delicatessens to a bookstore, a butcher shop, a fish market, and even the iconic Yamhill Market located in the middle of it all. This area was part of a mostly vanished culture that once peppered the downtown area. Lots of spots like it were mostly destroyed in the South Auditorium project, which also created growth and increased tax revenue while removing desperately needed low-income housing as well as a major cultural hub to the city. And one business, Dave's Delicatessen, had just been forced to move less than 2 years earlier when the block they were on was replaced with a parking garage. And now the owner, Abe Saltman, was facing the prospect of doing it all over again. Needless to say, the opposition was fierce from the start. With the plan for several retail store spaces in the CF project, the PDC tried extending an olive branch by suggesting at least some of those displaced businesses could move into one of these new retail spaces. But it had already been noted at this point that with the costs of this project, these new spaces would have substantially higher rents than whatever was there before, and these small businesses couldn't afford that. Some openly acknowledged just having to relocate would be more than they could handle. But even with this early resistance and the PDC stating they needed time to perform studies, CF was optimistic that they could begin work as early as the end of 1982. It seemed inevitable that the city would have to condemn the properties on these blocks, as no one seemed particularly excited about selling. This would have required a financial investment by the city. Altogether, it was projected the city would have to put out around $12 million into the efforts to get this project off the ground, and they would pay the bonds off for that with the increased tax revenue that would come once the project was done and the new buildings were up and running. Part of the deal was also that the city would sell this land to CF for less than it was worth. While claiming they needed to think it over, do their surveys, it seemed pretty clear the city was frothing at the mouth to make this project a reality. Lyndon Bowman, president of the Oregon chapter of Industrial Realtors, who expressed openly supporting the project, put it well when he said, "The basic issue we raise is a moral one, which seems to have been overlooked in all the excitement generated by this huge proposal. It concerns the city's use of its power of condemnation for one developer. This appears to be the first case where city officials have met with a developer in private, worked out plans to condemn private property, and agreed to resell it to him at a loss." Later, Bowman would also note, apparently the Cadillac Fairview situation is considered to be an exception to the rules because of its sheer size and complexity. I don't know if the PDC realized how bad a lot of this looked, and by the time of the first public hearing related to the project, they saw this resistance firsthand. Over 200 people crammed into the auditorium of the Water Service Building at 5th and Montgomery to express themselves. Some supported the project, some just wanted answers, but others were downright furious. Come May 8, 1979, the PDC, perhaps to the surprise of some, did not choose to endorse the project. This did not mean the thing was over, they just had numerous concerns in relation to the overall plan. These issues included concerns about the overall design of the new buildings, which it was felt were monolithic in appearance. The hope was that CF would be open to other design options. They also hoped that at least a portion of a block could be used for residential housing to help those primarily displaced from the Taylor Hotel. And even the PDC expressed concerns about likely having to use their condemnation powers to move this project forward, and how that was not likely going to go over well with most residents in town. And, as exciting as it was, this was a massive project guaranteed to create massive change, meaning everything needed to be prepped and handled just right. It appeared that CF was receptive to this, and in the following months, some new design ideas were presented to the PDC. One of the key changes pushed for was to make this new complex more outward than inward, meaning more store spaces facing the street as opposed to just mall space and stores with entrances not facing the street. This had been a key issue in the 1972 downtown plan, where the desire was to have an increase in first floor and street level stores for people to peruse. This updated design also included a 10-story parking structure that could hold up to 1,400 cars. The updates were well received by the PDC, setting the stage for another public hearing held at City Hall on June 27th. But as the city felt some of the resistance would let up, they were in for a rude awakening. Even the night before this hearing, there was a rally held in opposition of the project. And when the public hearing started, it was another instance of a packed crowd, most of whom spoke out against the project. Obviously, redesigning the buildings was not on the top of the list of concerns most people had. The condemnation issue came up. The PDC was called out for their seemingly cold demeanor towards those who were going to be displaced. And something that was also frequently popping up, which I will discuss in more detail in part 2, was the fact that there were 3 buildings of historical significance on those blocks, and there was heavy pressure put on to not demolish those buildings in the name of this redevelopment. There was also growing sentiment that for a project of this size, mind you, altering 4 downtown blocks, that it should have to go on a ballot for voters to decide on. And even that perspective ties in closely with hostilities regarding how this project came about in the first place. As a whole, the sentiment seemed to be that if this project went forward the way it was slated, that the PDC could essentially do as it pleased, even if the rest of the city was entirely against it. These people weren't against redevelopment. reviving downtown or the creation of new jobs. They just didn't like the way it was being done under these particular circumstances. Only a decade earlier, the people of the city watched an expansion project for the Emmanuel Hospital move forward, displacing hundreds of people. This project reached an advanced stage before they started taking public opinion on the matter. And after all the demolitions had happened, eviscerating a significant section of Portland's black neighborhood, the plan ended up being abandoned anyway. And I think at least some were looking at this project and, on a smaller level, seeing the similarities. So this is Southwest 5th and Taylor. So this is the southwesternmost block. Where this project would have been, it would have been this block, that block, next block down, and then the block, well, the other side of this big building. And this is all technically part of one complex today for the most part. So something did happen. So yeah, this is 5th Avenue. I'm walking along the southern portion of where the Cadillac Fairview project would have been. So I believe this is where the hotel was going to be. The office building was going to be on this block, and then the next block down from that one would have been the big department store. And these structures here, these are the only ones remaining from even when they were talking about doing the Cadillac Fairview project. Everything else has come afterwards. So this building here, and then we have the Old Taylor Hotel, the Gilbert Building historically is its name. These are the only buildings that still standing that were here in 1979. And the rest of this is essentially considered part of Pioneer Place. The main mall is the 2 blocks down there. This is associated with it, and then the rest of this block is mostly just a big parking garage right here. This all came around that same time. And of course the Max runs down Yam Hill, which this is the middle street cutting through where the project would have been, wrapping back around. So this is 3rd Avenue right up here and Yam Hill. So literally 4th and Yam Hill would be dead center right between all the 4 blocks. It's Pioneer Place. And this block I'm coming up to now, this is the middle block. This is 4th and Yam Hill. All 4 of these blocks, this one, that one right over there, and this one were all slated to be redeveloped. And I mean, you know, eventually was. So yeah, the department store would have been on this block. I mean, it's Pioneer Place. It's, you know, it's close. And then this next block, which is also part of Pioneer Place, this is where a lot of the other retail stores, eateries would have been, more the kind of smaller store spaces, kind of a mall setup, because this was going to be pretty much one building. This is, again, where the office building was going to be, and there probably would have been businesses on the ground floor. And then this one over here is where where the hotel would have been. So this would have been like the middle of the whole entire project. And you can kind of see, obviously most of what's here not that old in the broad scheme of things, but you can see how through the redevelopment, like there was, it totally, especially to buildings to the east, which this is more, this is like a historical district. So like you look right across 3rd Avenue here, and not the hotels over there so much, but like this is an older building. This is an older building, and so you've got this string of older architecture. There's more of it down there. So you can kind of see how, because a lot of what was here that was still standing was older architecture, and they tried saving some of the buildings, but there were some others that were almost as old as Taylor Hotel, the Corbett building, Good Enough building. And then like you have like the Mohawk building, which is fairly historic, right across the street here. And this is Morrison. Again, this is where the department store would have been, retail stores and such next block down. And yeah, there was references to this bridge in some of the articles. Or this parking garage. And I think one of the planned sky bridges was gonna go across to here. And ultimately, there were plans to have a parking garage here, but I feel like it wasn't a primary concern early on in the project. And I think because they were going to lose some parking, because a lot of this, what was here on these blocks, was street level parking that was going to get lost. And so I think maybe at first there was just an idea, oh, we'll just have everybody cram into this parking garage, while the city was already having, still dealing with traffic congestion problems they've been dealing with for decades, dealing with parking issues. And even as they were building some more parking garages like this, they were still having those issues. And so that may have been the kind of sentiment early on. Oh, we'll just make everyone park over here, and then our project over here won't get affected, and we'll be able to maximize the amount of land we have on these 4 blocks to, make this project as potentially profitable as we possibly can. But eventually, a parking garage did become a more focal part of the project. And it became more and more of a focal thing. Originally it was just kind of like, oh, okay, we'll stick a parking garage in here somewhere. Then it became more like we're gonna have like a multi-story structure. Despite the resistance and despite not endorsing the project before, come July 16th, the PDC put out a report in favor of the project, calling it essential to helping revive the city's downtown core. The projections that it would generate economic activity to the tune of $200 million annually was probably convincing as well. It was becoming too much to say no to, and at this point the PDC had put a few months into examining the project, and they were still asking for CF to include much of what's already been discussed, providing space for those displaced, including rental units, and so on. At the time, J. David Hunt, executive director of the PDC, noted if this one didn't happen, some other project would ultimately happen there, and perhaps not one with the benefits of this one. He was quoted to say, "Economics will finally do it. Those kinds of areas change. Where are the Yamhill markets? PDC didn't put them out. Urban renewal didn't put them out. These things keep changing all the time." That seemed to be the logic being followed. An interesting perspective, since the South Auditorium area bore a great similarity to what existed on these 4 blocks. And how did all of that go away? An urban renewal project pushed by the PDC. So yeah, the PDC had put places like this out. They didn't just magically change. It took redevelopment plans and action like CF was pursuing. Regardless, with the support of the PDC, the next step was to finally present the project to the City Council for approval. This presentation occurred at City Hall on July 24th, and even by this point the financial situation had changed. The once $85 million project was now projected to cost $100 million. With inflation, it would ultimately get to a point where CF told the city that with each passing month, the cost of the project would increase by $1 million. That $12 million that the city would need to invest for the project had also ballooned to $15 million. With the passage of time, it was just getting more and more expensive. And after the presentation to the city council, which was protested right outside with a gathering at Shrunk Plaza, the members of City Council reacted about the same way that everyone else with influence had. General agreement with it, but still lots of questions. Mayor Goldschmidt and councilors Connie McCready and Frank Ivancy expressed a favorable opinion on the project, while Councilor Charles Jordan was the strongest holdout, feeling that the city could just as easily redevelop the land. He also questioned how serious the PDC was about compensating for the low-income housing that would be lost in such a project. It was still technically moving forward, while simultaneously mired in stagnation. If the hope was that the people around town would eventually come around, well, on August 7th, the Oregon Journal newspaper released the results of a poll they conducted on how people felt about this project, and it wasn't great. Almost 2/3 called the project bad for Portland. More than 80% disapproved of the city using their condemnation powers in this case. More than 75% opposed the use of sky bridges in relation to the project, and more than 85% opposed the $12 to $15 million subsidy that the city would need to invest on the project. The condemnation aspect of the story seemed to be what bothered people the most. People didn't like the idea of property rights being so easily violated, obviously. And only a week after this poll, a further shakeup in town. Mayor Neil Goldschmidt, who was prominent in PDC's presentation to the council only weeks earlier, left his position as mayor when he was appointed as the Secretary of Transportation under then-President Jimmy Carter. On September 5th, councilperson Connie McCready was appointed as the new mayor by a vote of her fellow commissioners, with the next mayoral election less than a year away. Despite this change, with McCready having shown general support for the project to this point, it was thought little would change. By this time, with minor adjustments made, the outline of the 4-block complex was described as follows: a retail building with 3 levels of shops and 4 of offices around a ground-to-ceiling atrium. A full-block department store of 6 levels, overhanging the sidewalk on all sides and containing an atrium. Just to pause for a moment. That whole building hanging out over the sidewalk thing? Yeah, that was something else locals absolutely hated. Continuing on. A 22-story office tower with ground-level retailing around most of the block, and a hotel of 300 to 350 rooms with an I. Magnin store on its lower levels. Come October, the City Council took the next step in authorizing $102,000 to conduct a detailed study on the project. This massive study came on the heels of what was clearly increased hostility among the city's populace about this project. And come December, the results of this study were reported to the council, and the general attitude remained the same. They were in favor of the project, but, big surprise, major changes needed to be made. But this time around, the criticisms were stronger. While it had come up passively, an ever-increasing issue was the general design of the buildings that CF had planned. While they had adjusted their plans to have a more outward appearance, supposedly, the planned structures still had a monolithic appearance to them that this recent study said would create undesirable changes in the quality of the downtown area. And even while there was discussions about adjusting the design to have more outward ground-level store spaces to attract pedestrians on the sidewalk, by this point, the study noted, consultants also objected to the large amount of interior mall at ground level that would compete for sidewalk traffic and would result in inactive frontages unless most stores would double frontage, a management problem most retailers want to avoid. Another major concern was that in order for the project to be profitable, the costs to rent or lease space after the project was done would need to be even higher than previously thought. Hotel rooms would have to go for a minimum of $65 to $70 a night, which would be over $200 in today's money. Providing affordable space for displaced businesses or low-income housing on the site was looking less and less practical as the project was looking less and less profitable. And the necessity for use of condemning properties on the blocks was further verified. The project couldn't be done without it. When the survey was presented to the city, Mayor McCready was in agreement with its findings. Oh, and a little side note, the city was starting to get low on urban renewal funds. The dam looked like it was starting to crack just a little bit, and perhaps tensions were stronger than projected behind closed doors. It was also during this time that the first whisperings arose with regards to the possibility that the project could go south and that another developer might need to come in afterwards to develop a new project. This peaked with reports on December 28th of a full alternative development idea laid out by a San Francisco architect named Herb McLaughlin. The key reason he was hired by the city was to create a general plan for these 4 blocks that would save the historic buildings on site while still trying to revive the area in a retail sense. And then a few days later, a decade ended. Hello 1980. A new decade, a new hope for a city trying to find its way, maintaining an identity while acknowledging the needs for future change. And to take off in the new year, recently appointed Mayor McCready gave her State of the City address to the city. And she had something pretty interesting to say.